All right, so everyone knows by now that children learn by playing. We've been trying to teach through play for ages. Maybe some of you even played educational games as children. I played some of these games as a child, and I made an interesting observation. They just weren't as fun as other games. For years, I've wondered why. Did it have to be that way? Was there something innate about making games educational that also made them less interesting? In order to answer that question, we should look at several contributing factors. One of the terms describing games are their learning curves. Um, this term describes any skill, really. It refers to how difficult the skill is to learn. A high learning curve means something is difficult to learn. A low learning curve means it is easy. There are complicated games that are difficult to learn, but are also very rewarding. There are poorly designed games that are frustrating and difficult without being rewarding. There are also games that are easy but boring. Good games are challenging but also rewarding, because if a game is too easy, it quickly stops being interesting. We can take these basic statements about games to reveal a parallel about learning itself. If something is frustrating or too difficult, we often lose interest and stop learning. If something is too easy, we feel like we are wasting our time and we lose interest. So learning a language like English is complicated but also rewarding. People know this and rightly spend lots of time and money on mastering it. For many students, that fact alone is enough to motivate learning. For this and many other subjects, that means suffering through hours of boring classes with the hope of eventually gaining an interesting and useful skill that at some point down the road you will be able to use and you'll enjoy. We could do it so much better though. I, I teach English online, also in a local university, and I try to use natural learning methods for my students as much as possible. This means games or activities that help them to work towards the goals that use English as a tool as part of the process. This looks at learning English as a tool to be used rather than as a subject to be studied. It's a lot like learning to drive. You don't learn to drive by reading um, the instruction manual for the car. You get behind the wheel and you practice, though the instruction manual will teach you lots of useful things. We've all seen examples of gamification, I think. And what we have with gamification is taking an activity that is not inherently a game and turning it into one. Um, how is this different from an actual game? Well, this adds elements of a game to a learning activity. Often these elements feel forced, and the game would be much more fun if they were removed entirely. This is the case of many of those educational games I saw as a child. You can see here the game elements, things like quests, challenges, levels, competition versus collaboration. There's different ways to focus on the game, different rewards, but these are all game elements that you can add to an activity to make it more like a game. And like I said, this often feels forced. Games that teach language like this will often consist of word puzzles or other simple games that grant arbitrary progress for picking the right word or providing the right answer. Players, even children, intuitively know that there is something wrong here and that the skill has nothing to do with the game. That's why they often feel like educational games they don't feel as good as quote unquote real games. Um, well, here's another example. I think we can apply to games and learning, but it twists it 90 degrees. Um, if you've ever heard of the movie Karate Kid, in the movie Karate Kid, there was a kid who wanted to learn karate. He found a teacher who was willing to teach him, but said he needed to do some other things first. And he set him about doing some chores. And after days of doing these chores, the kid was fed up. It's like, why am I wasting my time with this? I want to learn karate. And then his teacher shows him that all the movements he was using with the chores were actually what he needed to be learning for learning karate. There were things that muscle memory that his body needed to learn. And he had that realization that, oh, what I've been doing all this time actually was helping. And that is, I think, a good analogy for what we need to do for teaching English. When children play for fun, what are they learning? Well, a little bit of everything. Motor control skills, language, social skills, ethics, cooperation, competition, things that are difficult to quantify into a lesson plan. But when people pay for classes, they want to know exactly what they're getting. You can't really sell, oh, let's play some games together and expose you to all the English that you want to know, and that'll teach you English. Now, you want something more quantified than that. Classes and textbooks take broad skills like speaking English and split them into digestible chunks that don't really resemble how the language is used, but make it more approachable for a student. We all know this isn't great, but it works enough for students so that a system gets established and students come to expect it. But they don't like it. And intuitively, they know that something is wrong, just like with those educational games of their childhood. Just like the kid in Karate Kid, we need a change in perspective. We all know that immersion or growing up in a language is the best way to learn, but that's impractical. Game and activity-based learning takes that unneeded burden away, but then becomes hard to quantify, just like immersion. So we go back to the question I asked before. Do games teach anything? It's something hard to point at. It's hard to point out exactly what players are learning when they are learning a game. But if you step back and look at it, there are often ways to analyze exactly what a person is learning in a game. And I have here an example. How to include Dungeons and Dragons on your resume. For those of you who don't know, Dungeons and Dragons is an RPG, that is a role-playing game where you have one person create a world and the others create characters and they go do things in it. It's basically play pretend for adults, and it is a very popular game among teens and adults. Um, and relevant skills, team building, meet with peers for twice monthly creative and conflict resolution exercises, gained necessary experience for character and skill development, learn to quickly assess situations and collaborate to find best practice solutions. That's not wrong. If you know how to look at things the right way and word things the right way, games definitely do teach you the skills that you need for things like, well, especially language use like English, but a lot more other things too. When we have, um, for English is the advantage that any game that relies on communication can be a valid teaching tool. Now, of course, not all games are equally good for this though, even when communication skills are needed in order to do well in a game. The best learning happens when you can discard any barriers to learning that don't have to do with the learning curve itself of those target skills. That means eliminating exercises that don't resemble real language use. When the games are done right, you keep thinking about them after the game is over. They're engaging. You spend your free time thinking about them, in fact, and that is what normally would be called homework and is not famous for being loved by students. The learning happens naturally, and the student is focused on the goals of the game and not the skills they need in order to win. But they do learn those skills because they have to. And that's the same way children learn, by playing. There are other popular games that are compared to paying to get a second job, in fact, because of the work that they require, but people pay for them and they love them. They are incredibly complex and often require learning skills that people would normally consider paying a university to learn. And here are some examples of those games. Here we have a little thing called Dwarf Fortress. It is an incredibly complex game that is, well, as you can see here, we have a flow chart describing different things that go on in this game. Any game that can be described with a flow chart like this, it's a good example of something that you are learning something from this game, and it's only a matter of trying to quantify that into a course in order to make this applicable for something that you would, say, learn in a university. Let's look at another one here. This is a game called EVE Online. It is a game where you can do lots of different things. It's space exploration and combat. It's basically life in space. Aside from having astronomy vocabulary, there are lots of skills that can be applied to the real world for a game like this. Obviously, not everyone will learn the same things because you get specialization and different people learning different things. I have been told that there are a number of university degrees that are extremely applicable to managing a game like this, particularly things like accounting and business management. Moving on to another one. This is a game called Stellaris, which I've actually used this for teaching one-on-one classes online for students around the world. It's fairly advanced. You have vocabulary sets ranging from things from um, sociology to economics to military science, astronomy, a little bit of everything. This game has little bits of everything. You're basically managing interstellar civilization and with all the things that come with it. This is a good example of a game that can be used to teach English because it has a high quantity of advanced vocabulary, more for advanced students, of course. It has lots of decisions that need to be made and lots of communication that happens for these decisions. And it's easy to pause and to discuss, and it's a conversation starter. So it has most of the main things you need to teach English. Another game that is extremely complex, has a high learning curve at any rate, is World of Warcraft. It's also known as one of the most addictive games ever. I'm kind of glad I never got into it. As you can see here, it has an intimidating amount of information presented on screen here. If a person wants to learn something like this, they have to spend hours of their time learning how this works, how the system works. The same kind of motivational power that games have to get people to learn incredible amounts of information can and should be applied for learning skills like English. And ultimately, that is the goal for something like this. My goal in using games to teach English, or any activities, it doesn't even have to be games, it depends on the interest of the student. These activities can create memories, motivation, reinforce skills, push limits, and overcome challenges that, in the end, push the players are motivated to win. But in order to win, they have to learn the skills that they want to learn. Those are the target skills. The experience of playing a game is all of those things. That is learning. If the student can get lost in the game and at the end realize that that was what they were looking for all along, but unlike the Karate Kid, they had fun doing it, then that is truly the best of both worlds. Thank you.